Okay, so chapter 18. This is the chapter when Seth tells Paul D what happened. In this chapter, she's circling. And a lot of times in literature, when a character is circling, they are not only walking in a circle, but they are circling the story. And Morrison even tells us that Seth is circling the story. Paul D has come in and he couldn't even ask her. He just shows her the newspaper article and she begins just to talk. And as she talks, she walks around the room and Paul D says it makes him dizzy. And she's really trying to tell him what it was like for her. And that's an important theme. We need to think about, one of the things that Morrison's doing in this novel is she is creating all of these different stories and kind of weaving them together. But each perspective is valid. Each experience is unique. And so she's trying to help Paul D to understand that he can't look at her life through his lens because he's not a mother, right? He doesn't know what it was like to try to figure out how to take care of these children when she didn't have any help. There wasn't another woman on the place who had Mrs. Garner was there, but Mrs. Garner didn't have children. There wasn't another mother on the place, on Sweet Home. So she is just trying, she's explaining to him, this is what it was like for me to have these children and not know really how to care for them and have to kind of learn on the fly. And she tells a story about how one of the boys was about to get bitten by red cora, which is the cow. I didn't know cows bite, but apparently they do. And she's telling that story, and red cora looked like it was about to bite him, and she said, "I just flew." So that's the way she describes her race to get to her son before he's under threat. And she has to tie him up when they're doing something with fire so that he doesn't get into the fire. And she doesn't like the look of it. I can't remember if we read the part from Harriet Jacobs where somebody gives Harriet Jacobs a chain, like a gold chain necklace, for her when her daughter is born, and she doesn't like the look of it. She does not want her daughter in chains. Setha doesn't want her child tied up, but she has to protect him. Okay, and so that idea, she says, "I flew," that's the same way she describes later in the chapter, that she describes her reaction when she sees school teacher. She sees his hat, and she says, "I just flew. I collected all of the parts of me that were good and clean, and I pushed, dragged, shoved them into the woodshed." So we have the same kind of language. I mean, we are to recognize that connection as her, when she says, "I flew," as her saying, every part of me, the impulse of every part of me was to protect those children. And so she's explaining it to Paul D, and this is the point at which I mentioned this earlier, where she says to love something without having to have permission. That's the true meaning of freedom. And she discovered that when she's free and she's there with her children. And in an earlier chapter, we saw how, when she arrived at Baby Suggs' house, the kids came to her and they laid around and on she got to rub their bellies, and they were hers. For the first time, they were hers. And that 28 days that she spent at Baby Suggs' house, it's the first time that she got to be a free mother, and she wasn't going back. And so when she sees school teacher, she talks about how, I think this is interesting, how the escape, she said, "I did it, Paul D. I got them out. I told them when to run, go now. I did it." It was the first accomplishment of her life. It's the first thing that she had ever done on her own. her own will. She made a choice and she acted on that choice. And she's proud of the fact that she did it all by herself. She got them out and they weren't going back. And so when he shows up, she's like, determined not to have them go back. So when she sees school teacher's hat, she says, no, 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 no. They are not going back. And she says she is going to push them over there behind the veil. Okay. We talked about this idea, this sort of traditional African idea of, and we saw it in Woman Warrior as well, No Name Woman and White Tigers, those two stories by Maxine Hong Kingston, the Chinese American writer, this idea of the dead just going into another realm. And so for her, this is just moving them. I mean, as she's thinking about it, and what we're seeing is her rationale. So where school teacher had said she had gone wild, Setha is explaining to us that this was for her, not wildness. It was well-reasoned. Now, we may not agree with that reasoning, but it was well-reasoned. And so she was just going to move them, in her mind, just move them behind the veil into another realm of existence. And her plan was to kill all of them and herself so that they would all go together. She only succeeded in killing the one daughter. And she says, I just flew in these little hummingbird beaks. She talks about these little hummingbird beaks, like this tingling in her scalp, which is almost like, I mean, I read that as almost like a trance-like state. That she has just shifted into that moment of trance-like desperation where she is just acting. And Paul D listens to this story and he says, your love is too thick. Right? Love is a risk. Remember that. Your love is too thick. And she's like, too thick? There's not thick love and thin love. There's just love. He's saying, you love them too much. And a slave can't afford to love somebody that much. She's like, love is love. There's not thick love and thin love. But Paul D has told us, love just a little bit. So when you lose what you love, you've got some love left for the next thing. But don't take that kind of risk. She's like, love is love. And then he said, what you did is wrong, Setha. There could have been a way. Some other way. She's like, what way? What options did I have? And then he says the thing that causes a forest to spring up between them. He says, you've got 2 feet, Setha, not 4. Even Paul D has internalized that idea of wildness. He said, he's basically saying to her, you're not an animal. And for her, this wasn't an animal act. This was a very human, and in her mind, humane act to spare her children from the horror of slavery. I mean, it's this, like, when he says there could have been a way, some other way. She's like, what way? I mean, it's like being between a rock and a hard place. What were her options? And she doesn't understand why he doesn't understand that. But he doesn't, because he's not a mother. He's not a parent. Okay, so that gets us to the end of book 1. Book 2, we're not reading all of the rest of the novel. I broke it down into, I took a few chapters out that are a little abstract. You can read them if you want. You can ask questions about them if you want. Otherwise, chapter 19, and then skip 20, 21, 22, 23, and then start at 24 to the end. Okay, that's it.